Welcome to Unshakable Belief, the podcast where we investigate the stories, beliefs, and survival strategies that shape the way we think, feel, lead, and live so we can reconnect with who we were truly created to be. I'm Monica Azoulay, speaker, author, behavior and identity investigator, and the creator of the Reset methodology. If you've ever caught yourself wondering, why do I keep doing this? Why is this so hard to change? Or how did I become this version of myself? You're in the right place because around here, we don't judge behavior, we investigate it because behavior leaves clues. Let's get started.
Can I be honest with you before we begin today? After spending the last 3 weeks talking about perfectionism, I wish I could tell you that I don't struggle with it anymore. I do. Almost every day. It shows up before I hit publish, before I walk on a stage, before I launch something new, before I have a difficult conversation or press send on an email, even before I release an episode like this one. That voice still whispers, maybe you should wait. Maybe you need one more revision. Maybe you're not quite ready. Maybe someone else could explain this better. Maybe you should hold on to it a little longer until it's perfect. That voice still exists. The difference is, I don't believe everything that it says anymore. And that changed everything. Welcome back to Unshakeable Belief. Over the last 3 weeks, we've been on a journey together. We started by asking whether perfectionism was actually our problem. Then we discovered something that surprised a lot of people. Perfectionism isn't the problem. It's the behavior. Behavior leaves clues. Then we asked a harder question. If perfectionism isn't our identity, what is it protecting? Together, we discovered that perfectionism isn't trying to make us excellent. It's trying to make us safe. It's protecting us from criticism, from rejection, from shame, failure, vulnerability, from being seen. Then last week, we counted the cost. We looked honestly at what perfectionism has taken from us. The opportunities that we delayed, the joy we postponed, the relationships that suffered, the dreams we kept waiting to begin, the pressure, the exhaustion, the endless moving finish line. And maybe, for the first time, some of you realized you weren't just carrying high standards. You were carrying an old survival strategy. Today, I want to talk about what comes next. Not because I have all the answers, not because I've conquered perfectionism, not because I've arrived, but because I've learned something I desperately wish someone had taught me years ago. Healing isn't becoming a person who never struggles. Healing is becoming a person who recognizes the struggle before it starts making the decisions. For years, I thought that healing meant getting rid of fear, getting rid of perfectionism or self-doubt, getting rid of insecurity. I thought freedom looked like never hearing those voices again. Now, I don't believe that's what freedom looks like at all. It isn't silence, it's discernment. Freedom is recognizing which voice deserves your attention. Because there are a lot of voices competing for our lives. Fear has a voice. Shame has a voice. Your past has a voice. Trauma has a voice. Your nervous system has a voice. Culture and your inner critic both have a voice. The question isn't, how do I make every voice disappear? The question is, which voice gets to lead? That question changed my life. Because for so many years, I didn't even realize that perfectionism had become my leader. I thought I was leading. I thought I was making thoughtful decisions, responsible decisions, wise decisions. But if I was really honest, many of the decisions weren't being led by wisdom. They were being led by fear that happened to sound responsible. There's a difference. And if we're not paying attention, it's almost impossible to tell the two apart. That's why awareness is so important. You can't change what you don't notice. You can't question a voice you automatically obey. You can choose differently if you don't realize you can't choose differently. You can't choose differently if you don't realize you've been making decisions from an old survival strategy. One of the greatest gifts that the reset methodology has given me isn't that I no longer experience perfectionism. It's that I recognize it sooner, sometimes much sooner. I'll be sitting at my computer, rewriting the same paragraph for maybe the sixth time, and I catch myself. I stop and I ask, what is happening here? Not what's wrong with me. Those are different questions. What's wrong with me leads to shame. What's happening here leads to curiosity. Curiosity changes everything because it creates space and it interrupts the automatic pattern. Instead of immediately obeying perfectionism, I become an investigator. What am I afraid of right now? What story am I believing? What am I trying to protect? Is this really about making this better, or am I trying to make rejection impossible? Am I trying to make criticism or failure impossible? Because here's something I've learned. Perfectionism never actually promises excellence. It promises certainty. And certainty is something this life simply cannot give us. No amount of preparation or planning can guarantee success or acceptance. No amount of editing guarantees everyone will understand you. And no amount of achievement guarantees you'll never be criticized. So if certainty isn't possible, then maybe it's never what God was asking us to pursue. Maybe he was inviting us to pursue something entirely different. Not certainty, faithfulness. I think those two words have been confused for a very long time. Certainty says, I'll move when I know exactly how this is going to turn out. Faithfulness says, I'll take the next step with what I've been given today. Certainty waits for guarantees, and faithfulness responds to invitations. Certainty wants the whole map. Faithfulness is willing to take the next step. This has become one of the biggest shifts in my own life. I still prepare. I still practice. I still care deeply about doing things well. But my goal is no longer to eliminate every possibility of failure. My goal is to faithfully steward what has been placed in front of me. Those are two different ways of living. The first is exhausting. The second, it brings peace. One of the biggest shifts I've experienced over the last few years isn't that perfectionism disappeared. It's that I finally stopped arguing with it. Now, that might sound strange. For years, every time perfectionism showed up, I treated it like an enemy. I criticized myself for being so hard on myself. I got frustrated that I was overthinking. I judged myself for procrastinating. I became angry that I couldn't just get over it. Can you hear what I was doing? I was responding to perfectionism with more perfectionism. I expected myself to heal perfectly or stop struggling immediately. I expected myself to never fall back into old patterns. Isn't that interesting? Even our healing can become another performance. We start believing that if we've really healed, we'll never struggle again. We'll never get triggered again. We'll never doubt ourselves again. We'll never overthink another decision. But that's not healing. That's another impossible standard. Healing doesn't erase your humanity. It just teaches you how to respond to it differently. Today, when perfectionism shows up, I don't panic. I don't shame myself. I don't sit and think, I can't believe I'm still dealing with this. Instead, I pause. I notice it, and I usually smile because I recognize the pattern. I know the voice, and I know what it's trying to do. It's trying to protect me. That doesn't mean I have to let it lead me. That's where everything changes. You see, there's a difference between having a thought and believing a thought. There's a difference between hearing fear and following fear. There's a difference between recognizing an old survival strategy and allowing that strategy to make today's decisions. For years, I thought awareness was enough. It isn't. Awareness creates the opportunity. Choice creates the transformation. That's why I love the reset process so much. Not because it's another framework to memorize, but because it slows me down enough to make a different choice. When perfectionism shows up now, the first thing I do is recognize it, not judge it. I recognize it. I simply notice. There you are. That's different than saying, I'm failing again. Recognition isn't condemnation, it's awareness. Then I examine what's happening. What story is playing in my mind? What am I believing? What's creating this pressure? Sometimes I discover I'm telling myself that if this podcast episode isn't perfect, people won't listen. If my keynote isn't perfect, no one will invite me back. If the coaching session isn't perfect, I'll disappoint someone. The stories are almost always bigger than the situation. Then I study the survival strategy. What is perfectionism trying to protect today? Am I trying to avoid criticism, rejection, embarrassment? Am I trying to avoid disappointing someone? When I ask those questions, something interesting happens. The pressure begins to lose its grip. Because I've stopped treating perfectionism like my identity, and I started treating it like information. Then comes one of the most important questions. Is this belief even true? Not, does it feel true? Two different questions. Because fear often feels true. Shame feels true, and old stories can feel true. But feelings, they're not facts. Just because my nervous system believes something is dangerous doesn't automatically mean it is. Sometimes my nervous system is responding to an old environment, while I'm living in a completely different one. That's why truth matters so much. Truth grounds us in reality instead of history. Truth reminds us that I don't have to earn my worth. It reminds me that criticism isn't the same thing as rejection, and that making a mistake doesn't make me a mistake. It reminds me that one imperfect moment doesn't define my identity. It reminds me that God isn't asking me to be flawless. He's asking me to be faithful. Then comes the final step, choice. Not a dramatic choice. It's usually a very small one. Maybe I hit publish. Maybe I hit send on the email. I stop editing. I make the phone call. Maybe I wear the outfit. Maybe I ask the question. Maybe I let the house be good enough. Or I say yes before I feel completely ready. Healing usually doesn't happen in one giant leap. It's thousands of small decisions. Each one quietly telling your nervous system, we're safe. We're okay. We're not living there anymore. One imperfect choice at a time. It's teaching your brain a new story. A story that says, I can be seen and still be safe. I can make mistakes and still be worthy. I can receive feedback and still trust myself. I can disappoint someone and still be loved. I can release something before it feels perfect and the world won't end. That's how peace begins. Not because perfectionism disappears, but because perfectionism slowly stops being the loudest voice in the room. Instead, truth becomes louder, grace becomes louder, purpose becomes louder. And eventually, you begin trusting those voices more than the old one. Not because you've become perfect, but because you've become present. And that's where freedom starts. There was a time in my life when I thought peace was something I would experience someday. Someday. When I finally had everything figured out, when I reached the goal, lost the weight, healed enough, when my business was where I wanted it to be, when I was speaking on bigger stages, when I had more confidence, or never made mistakes. Peace always seemed to exist just over the next hill. But every time I climbed one, another one appeared. Because perfectionism has a remarkable ability to move the finish line. It convinces us that peace is something we earn, that once we have proven ourselves, then we'll finally be able to rest. The problem? There's always another mountain, another goal, another expectation, another opportunity to prove ourselves. Eventually, I had to ask myself a question. What if peace isn't waiting for me at the finish line? What if peace has been available all along and I've simply been too busy performing to receive it? I realized peace isn't the reward for perfection. Peace is the environment where healing happens. Think about it for a moment. Most of us believe we have to heal first, then we'll experience peace. But what if it's the other way around? What if healing actually requires us to begin practicing peace before everything is resolved? That's incredibly uncomfortable for perfectionists because we've been taught that rest is something you have to earn, that slowing down is lazy, that saying no is selfish, and that asking for help means you're weak. Can I lovingly challenge that belief? Who taught you that? Where did you learn that your value increases every time you accomplish something? Where did you learn that exhaustion is evidence of faithfulness? Where did you learn that carrying everything yourself makes you stronger? Because I don't think those messages came from God. Jesus never praised exhaustion. He never celebrated performance. He never invited people into endless striving. In fact, some of his most repeated invitations sound nothing like perfectionism. Come to me. Follow me. Don't be afraid. Peace I leave with you. Abide in me. None of those invitations require perfection. They require presence. That's one of the biggest shifts I've experienced. I used to think my relationship with God depended on how well I performed for him. Now I understand that transformation happens because I remain connected to him. There's a difference between working for acceptance and living from acceptance. Perfectionism works for it, and grace lives from it. Perfectionism says, I'll be enough when, and grace says you already belong. Perfectionism says, keep proving yourself. Grace says, you don't have to. Perfectionism says, don't let anyone see your weakness. Grace says, Grace says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. If I'm honest, I still have to choose between them almost every day. There are still mornings when perfectionism wakes up before I do. There are days when I catch myself thinking, this podcast episode isn't good enough. This keynote needs another rewrite. Maybe I should wait. Maybe people aren't ready. Maybe I'm not ready. The thoughts still come. What has changed is what I do with them. I don't automatically believe them anymore. I hold them up against truth. Is this thought leading me toward freedom or towards fear? Is this voice inviting me into faithful stewardship or endless self-protection? Is this conviction or is it condemnation? Conviction moves us towards growth, and condemnation keeps us trapped in shame. Conviction is specific and condemnation is personal. Conviction says, let's grow. Condemnation says, you'll never be enough. One sounds like the heart of God. The other sounds like the voice perfectionism has been repeating for years. One of the greatest gifts you can give yourself is learning to recognize the difference. Not every critical thought deserves your agreement. Not every fearful thought deserves your obedience. Not every anxious thought deserves your attention. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is simply let the thought pass through without handing it the keys to your life. I've started imagining perfectionism as a passenger instead of the driver. It still gets in the car sometimes. It still has opinions, and it still points out everything that could go wrong. Tells me where I should turn around, but it doesn't get to hold the steering wheel anymore. Truth does. Purpose does. Faith does. Love does. That doesn't mean the journey is always easy. It means I finally know who's driving. I think that's what healing really looks like. Not eliminating every fearful voice, but choosing over and over again which voice deserves to lead. That's peace. Not because life is perfect, but because your identity is no longer being negotiated every time fear speaks. And when you begin living from that place, something beautiful starts to happen. You stop asking, what if I fail? And you begin asking, what if I finally live? That's the question that perfectionism never wants you to ask. Because living requires vulnerability, trust, showing up before everything feels finished. Living requires believing that your worth isn't on trial. And once you begin believing that, everything starts to change. So where do we go from here? Not tomorrow, not next year, not when you finally figured everything out. Where do we go from here? Today. I think we begin by giving ourselves permission to stop auditioning for a life we've already been invited into. Think about that. How much of your life has been spent trying to prove you deserve to be where you already are? Trying to prove you're smart enough, qualified enough, spiritual enough, successful enough, strong enough, trying to prove you're enough. The tragedy of perfectionism isn't just that it exhausts us. The tragedy is that it keeps asking us to earn what has already been freely given. God never asked you to earn his love before he could use your life. In fact, Scripture is full of ordinary people who felt completely unqualified. Moses didn't think he could speak well enough. Gideon didn't think he was strong enough. Esther didn't think she was in the right position. Jeremiah thought he was too young. Peter failed publicly. Thomas doubted openly. Paul carried a thorn he desperately wanted removed. None of them were chosen because they were perfect. They were chosen because they were willing. Isn't that comforting? Because willingness is available to every one of us. Perfection isn't. I think that's one of the greatest lies perfectionism ever told me. It convinced me that God was waiting for a better version of myself, a version that had it all together, that never questioned myself, that never felt afraid, never made mistakes. But that version doesn't exist. And if God waited for that version, nothing in my life would have happened. Not the books, not the podcasts, the speaking, the coaching, none of it. Because every single one of those things began before I felt ready. I've never launched something and thought, perfect, there's absolutely nothing left to improve. I've never walked onto a stage believing I couldn't possibly learn anything from this experience. I've never recorded an episode thinking this is the best I'll ever do. Growth doesn't work that way. Growth is always unfinished. It's always becoming, stretching. That's exactly where God meets us. Not at the finish line, in the becoming. Maybe that's why I love the word stewardship so much. Stewardship isn't about perfection. It's about faithfulness. It's asking, with what I've been given today, how can I honor it? Not, how can I make sure nobody ever criticizes it? Those are different questions. One produces peace. The other produces pressure. As we close this series, I want to leave you with one simple practice. Not 5 steps, not another checklist, just one practice. The next time perfectionism speaks, pause. Take one slow breath and ask yourself 3 questions. What is this voice trying to protect? Is that protection still necessary today? What would the next faithful step look like instead? Not the perfect step, not the safest step, not the guaranteed step. The next faithful step. Sometimes that step will be pressing publish, asking for help, resting, saying no. or simply allowing yourself to be seen exactly where you are. Don't underestimate those small moments. Transformation is rarely one dramatic decision. It's thousands of ordinary moments where you choose truth instead of fear. When you choose presence instead of performance, purpose instead of protection, faith instead of certainty. And eventually, those choices begin changing the way you see yourself. You stop introducing yourself as, I'm just a perfectionist. Instead, you begin saying, I've learned perfectionism is one of the ways my nervous system tries to protect me. Can you hear the difference? One is an identity, the other is a behavior. One keeps you stuck, the other creates freedom because behaviors can change. Identities rooted in truth don't have to. Over the last month, we've taken a journey together. We started by discovering that perfectionism wasn't your identity. Then we investigated what it was protecting. Then we counted the cost. Today, we talked about choosing a different way forward. Not because the voice disappears, but because you've learned it doesn't have to lead. And maybe, just maybe, that's what freedom really is. Not waking up one morning without fear, but waking up and realizing fear no longer gets to make your decisions. That's the life I want for you. Not a life without challenges or uncertainty, not even a life without perfectionism occasionally whispering in your ear. I want a life where purpose is louder than your protection, where your calling is louder than your criticism, where grace is louder than shame and truth is louder than fear. Because I believe that's the life that God has always been inviting us into. So as we finish this series, I want you to remember something. You don't have to become someone else. You don't have to earn your worth. You don't have to prove your value. And you don't have to perform your way into belonging. You don't have to wait until you're perfect to begin living. You simply have to take the next faithful step, one imperfect decision at a time, one courageous conversation at a time, one act of trust at a time, one surrendered moment at a time. Because healing was never about becoming flawless. It's about becoming free. If this series has encouraged you, challenged you, or helped you see yourself through a different lens, I'd love for you to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for spending this month with me. Thank you for being willing to investigate instead of judge. Thank you for choosing curiosity over shame and for believing that change is possible. Until next time, remember, behavior leaves clues. Curiosity replaces shame. Truth creates freedom. And you were made for more.
If today's episode resonated with you, I want to invite you to take the next step. Understanding your patterns is powerful, but lasting transformation happens when you begin putting that understanding into practice. That's exactly why I created Return to Herself. Beginning October 5th, this live 4-week coaching experience is designed to help you move beyond simply recognizing your survival strategies and begin reconnecting with the woman you've always been beneath the pressure, perfectionism, and expectations. If you're ready to stop surviving and start living with greater clarity, confidence, and intention, I'd love to have you join us. You'll find all the details and registration information in the show notes. And if this episode encouraged you, challenged you, or made you see yourself in a new way, would you take just a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it? You never know how one conversation can change someone's life. Until next time, remember, behavior leaves clues, curiosity replaces shame, truth creates freedom, and you were made for more.